Good morning. I'm Charles Gallia, and I'm serving as your worship associate today. And I want to say that this topic was really a great choice for me. Voting, elections, and governance have been topics that have punctuated my life for a long time. It started actually when I was pretty young. My father died when I was 3, and when I was 6 years old, I remember seeing John Kennedy watch his father's horse-drawn carriage carrying his casket down the street. And I didn't understand why there was all this attention from around the world, but I asked my mom, and she said simply and wisely that the world loved him. But that answer didn't prove to be quite good enough for me. I still didn't understand. And later in life, as I started to form my own opinions and judgments, I wondered why people were engaged in politics and some weren't, and some were. But whatever it was, I noticed there's a lot of people that didn't have that fire. And I was president at Clackamas High School, and so in order to address one of this lack of participation, I asked my other student council members what they might suggest, and so we decided to hold a rally. It was an anti-apathy rally. Well, turns out nobody showed up. In college, I studied political science, and my graduate work was on vote choice in presidential elections. I taught American government, and I ended up getting a PhD in public administration and policy, and ended up running for office a few times. And what I've learned through that intellectual journey is that I wouldn't find the answer I was seeking. What I've learned is that the seeds of hope and change are sown here. They're informed, and they grow, and they're nurtured by what comes through here. And I understand what my mom meant. For this connection to work, we can't be in a state of trauma. We can't be in that reactive mindset. And one of the voices that provides that reset for me is Maya Angelou. And I thought how wonderful it would be to hear her voice. And I replayed some of her speeches that have occurred that are still on YouTube. And I have a sense of what she might say. And in her honor, and by no means to emulate her style or whatever, I wrote a poem, and I'm calling it A Work in Progress. In times like these, her voice would say, be the rainbow, light the way. In moments dark, rise proud and true. The stars and stripes belong to you. A storm may gather, skies grow gray, but courage calls, and we will not sway. Our strength is forged in freedom's fire. Each heart, each hand lifts us all higher. Stand up, Americans, side by side, with honor fierce and boundless pride. This land, this dream is yours to hold. Be brave, be bold, let truth unfold. Not by fear shall we be led, but by the hopes our forebears said. Rise to guard and grow liberty and peace and justice through those dreams they be. Pluralism is democracy, empowerment for all you see. We need not always agree, for voting itself is a victory. For it's our voice, our path to make, with steps of joy without fear for our sake, Together strong, we'll face each test and shape a future while at our best. So rise, America, tall and strong, in hope, in truth, where all belong. For every vote, a flame is lit, a future to which we recommit. Let courage, hope, and joy resound. Be the rainbow where clouds abound. Freedom and justice are the prize. We are American, and we will rise.
Our reading today is from Jason Stanley and his book, How Fascism Works, The Politics of Us and Them. The dangers of fascist politics come from the particular way which it dehumanizes segments of the population. By excluding these groups, it reduces the capacity for empathy among other citizens, leading to the justification of inhumane treatment, from repression of freedom, mass imprisonment, and expulsion to in extreme cases, mass extermination. The Affordable Care Act has made a huge difference in the life of my family. In the 80s and 90s, my parents didn't have health insurance. Eventually, they ended up with a catastrophic only plan that would have covered them if they spent $20,000 or something. They were in their 50s. They lived on the Oregon coast in an area not served by preferred provider organizations, and they were smokers. They were self-employed and ran their own business and couldn't afford the several $1,000s a month that an individual policy would have cost them at that point. When my mother ended up in the hospital with double pneumonia, and later my dad needed emergency surgery, they paid off those bills $100 a month at a time, with the hospital crediting them $200 for each payment. It took them over a decade to pay off those bills. Later, when I was working for a chiropractor, he said he'd pay for my health insurance. But I was denied coverage by the first company I tried because at 160 pounds, I was deemed high risk because I was too fat. When my dad turned 65 and qualified for Medicare, he finally got the health care that he had been putting off because he couldn't afford it. We called it his 65,000-mile checkup, and he was diagnosed with prostate cancer and told he needed both carotid artery surgery and a triple bypass. I am so grateful that he was able to get the care that he needed, and at 83, he's doing okay. He just bought a mobile home in a 55 and older park and is moving to Beaverton to be closer to me and to be in a place where he can make some friends and build some community. I'm really grateful for this. Because of the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, my kids have been able to get the physical and mental health care they needed. It used to be that therapy wasn't included in most health plans. And they were able to stay on my insurance until Mika turned 26. And she stayed on my insurance until she turned 26. Also because of the Affordable Care Act, Mika now has really good health insurance through the state of Oregon. The Oregon Health Plan covers her health care. And as a person with several chronic health conditions, she needs a lot of care. As much as some Republicans rail against Obamacare, it has proven to be very popular across the board, allowing young people, disabled folks, self-employed people, and people with pre-existing conditions to afford and have access to health insurance. But in 2008, all of this was in doubt. The Senate filibuster, a strange rule that states that if one senator doesn't want to vote on a piece of legislation, that senator can filibuster, and it takes 60 votes to override such a stop. It is why 400 military promotions were held up for 11 months, because Senator Tommy Tuberville refused to confirm military promotions and nominations. One person could halt the confirmations of the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the leaders of various commands, including the Navy's Pacific Command, because one person didn't think that the military should pay for service members to travel to access abortion care. The filibuster has halted nominees for Supreme Court justices and for many pieces of legislation. But in 2008, the makeup of the Senate was in doubt for many months because the election in Minnesota was so close. Eventually, after a recount and months of litigation, it was decided that Al Franken, a Democrat, had defeated the incumbent Republican Senator Norm Coleman by just 312 votes. My friends, those 312 votes meant that the Democrats held a 60-40 majority, meant that the Republicans couldn't filibuster the Affordable Care Act. 40 million people have health insurance because of 312 votes. We are facing an election this week that has many of us frightened for a few reasons. First, because we will decide who runs the country, and the choice couldn't be more stark. But also because one candidate has put more time and effort into sowing anxiety about the results of the election ahead of time. And this is a candidate who has proven that when he doesn't win an election, he will threaten everyone from poll workers to governors to the members of the House of Representatives and even the vice president of his own party to come up with a different way of counting votes that declares him the winner. He will rile up his supporters and send them to riot in the Capitol building. We saw it happen. And many of us are afraid that it will happen again. I am not here to tell you who to vote for. That is between you and your conscience. And electioneering is forbidden in nonprofit spaces such as churches. And one of the purposes of church, of religious communities in general, is to speak truth to power, to be a moral voice in turbulent times. And so I am going to speak truth to power today, even if my voice shakes. And another crucial purpose of religious community is to temper terror with hope, to remind us that we have the power to make changes and to bend the arc of the universe ever so slowly towards justice. And so I'm going to tell you some scary things today, friends, but we won't end there because it doesn't end there. A year ago in June, my friend and colleague, the Reverend Cecilia Kingman, delivered the Berry Street Lecture to the Unitarian Universalist Ministers Association, entitled "My Little Pony Was Right: Reflections of Fascism Within and Without." She spoke movingly of the techniques of fascism, highlighting and quoting from Jason Stanley's work. Stanley is the author of How Fascism Works: The Politics of Us and Them, and is a professor and scholar of philosophy and propaganda at Yale. He describes fascism as an ideology, but also, and perhaps more importantly, as a political method. Now, I don't watch much direct television. If I watch TV, it's almost always on streaming services. And so I have pretty much missed out, thank goodness, on the political ads that have blanketed the airwaves for the last few months. But as I watched the last half of the last game of the World Series on broadcast TV this week, I was stunned to realize how closely many of the advertisements mirrored the techniques of fascism that Stanley identifies. I'm going to tell you about each technique, and then I'm going to tell you where I see it happening. The first thing that Stanley explains is that these 10 tactics are bundled, that they can't be separated and isolated from each other. The first technique is called a mythic past. There was once a glorious past where we were a great nation. It's important to note that he wrote this book in 2017, maybe 2016. He didn't write it about a particular person. We aren't a glorious nation anymore because the dominant racial group isn't ruling over others anymore. And we didn't lose this, it was taken away. I see this really distinctly in the Make America Great slogan. We're going to go back to when America was great. But nowhere does he define what made America great and who it was great for, because it was a lot worse for women, for people of color, for queer people. But we aren't who he's talking about, are we? Propaganda is the second tactic. While all social movements and politics use propaganda to persuade, fascist propaganda makes a distinction between friends and enemies, between us and them. According to Reverend Kingman, it casts the others as a threat and presents the idea that the others are fundamentally opposed to the nation. I see these patterns especially clearly in the demonization of immigrants that Trump and his supporters are engaging in. In particular, the dehumanization of immigrants, those who entered legally or not. The Haitian immigrants to Springfield have been a particular touchstone of wrath and falsehoods, with Trump saying repeatedly they were eating the pets of other residents. In reality, Springfield, Ohio, a town of about 60,000 people, welcomed thousands of legal immigrants from Haiti who were felt to be a boost to the local economy. In a tragic accident, a Haitian immigrant driving without a valid license veered over the center line while driving home from an overnight work shift and forced a school bus off the road, tragically injuring several kids and killing one, Aiden Clark, who was 11. As horrific as this was, and losing a child is horrific, the Clark's troubles have been hugely aggravated when, according to the New York Times, President Donald Trump and his running mate J.D. Vance began to tell a different story. They said Aiden's death was not a traffic accident, but a murder committed by an illegal as part of a border bloodbath in another American community that had been invaded, conquered, and taken over by migrant criminals from the dungeons of the Third World. And so now, instead of just mourning their son, the Clark family has to deal with his memory and his image being used by Proud Boys and a neo-Nazi group called Blood Tribe, who are marching in their town with pictures of their son. There have been 30 bomb threats, and the family has been threatened. Their phone number and addresses have been spread over the internet. The Clark family wanted to live in a diverse community. Both parents were teachers who made an effort to learn other languages to communicate with their immigrant students. They were horrified that their kind, compassionate son's death was being used as a flashpoint for hatred. I wish that my son, Aiden Clark, was killed by a 60-year-old white man, Nathan said in a city council meeting. I bet you never thought anyone would say something so blunt. But if that guy killed my 11-year-old son, the incessant group of hate-spewing people would leave us alone. They make it seem as though our wonderful Aiden appreciates their hate, that we should follow their hate, and that needs to stop now. Tactic number 3 is anti-intellectualism. In March, during a campaign rally, Trump said, "On day one, I will sign a new executive order to cut federal funding for any school pushing critical race theory, transgender insanity, and any other inappropriate racial, sexual, or political content onto our children, and I will not give one penny to any school that has a vaccine mandate or a mask mandate." Tactic number 4 is creating a type of unreality, the idea that there isn't a truth, but that everyone is lying, and therefore lies don't matter. I'm gonna leave with that one right there, but if you need more, you can go back to the whole immigrants eating pets thing. The fifth and sixth categories of fascism are hierarchy and victimhood. Hierarchy is absolutely central to fascism. According to Stanley, it is the big lie at the center of things. White supremacy, male supremacy, able-bodied supremacy, these lines assign people superiority and the privileges and benefits that go with that superiority. And then once you've convinced people that they are appropriately higher in the hierarchy, it is easy to convince them that they are victims of equality. Muslims, immigrants, liberals. According to Trump, all of these people are rapists and murderers coming to take our jobs and kill our children. I also saw this in Oregon in the early 90s when the campaigns against gays and lesbians were centered on the idea of special rights. Loggers and fishers were hurting economically and somehow giving less than 5% of the population equal rights in terms of family benefits or the right to not be fired or be denied housing was seen as special rights, as if every queer person was suddenly going to be handed a great job and a nice apartment. Kingman writes, "The seventh tactic of fascism is law and order. Under fascism, the definition of law-abiding means loyalty to the dominant group. Members of the dominant group, by their very nature, are seen as law-abiding. Marginalized groups are seen by their very nature as not being law-abiding, and law and order has nothing to do with justice or equality." The New York Times quotes Donald Trump in an opinion article titled "Believe Him" as saying, "I think the bigger problem is the enemy from within. Not even the people that have come in and destroying our country, by the way, totally destroying our country, the towns, the villages, they're being inundated, but I don't think they're the problem in terms of election day. I think the bigger problem are some people from within. We have some very bad people. We have some sick people, radical left lunatics, and I think and it should be easily handled by the National Guard, or if really necessary, by the military, because they can't let that happen." Tactic number 8, sexual anxiety. Kingman notes, "In every case, across different cultural and historical settings, the fascist leader will always say, 'Your women and children are under threat. You need a strong man to protect your families.' Fascists make conservatives overwhelmingly terrified of transgender rights and gay, lesbian, and bisexual people and their families. According to fascists, these targeted groups are not simply trying to peacefully live their own lives. They are trying to destroy the majority's life, and they are coming for the majority's children." Some of the most shocking commercials I saw during the baseball game were ones linking Democrats to trans rights. One commercial was a female high school wrestler stating that she would lose her scholarship to college if a particular candidate was elected because she'd let trans women compete in sports where they would clearly win unfairly, as well as harm girls in locker rooms. "She's not protecting us," the young woman said. And I am scared because all the talk about protecting women is coming from the same people who are causing violence against women on several counts. First, by passing laws that threaten doctors who provide not only abortions, but general health care in emergency cases that values the lives of fetuses over the lives of their mothers. According to CNN, and this shocked me, states that have restricted access to abortion services had maternal death rates in 2020 that were 62% higher than in states preserving access to abortion services. Between 2018 and 2020, the maternal death rate increased twice as fast in states that now have abortion restrictions. Tell me how that is pro-life. And ProPublica notes that an 18-year-old in Texas suffering from sepsis was turned away from emergency rooms twice before doctors at a third visit required 2 ultrasounds to make sure her fetus no longer had a heartbeat before they would move her into intensive care. She died within hours. The final tactics of fascism are what Stanley calls Sodom and Gomorrah, contrasting hardworking laborers in rural areas with urban folks who work in the suspect intellectual jobs. Trump has made a movement that claims to focus on middle America and their less populous electoral votes, even though his economic policies give far more breaks to the wealthy. But unlike previous presidents, Trump specifically wants the benefits of government to go only to his supporters, threatening to withhold disaster aid from California and other areas with governors who don't support him. Perhaps even more frightening, he spread rumors in areas hit hard by hurricanes that Democrats wouldn't respond to their needs, or that taking federal aid would lead to a cutoff of any other benefits, including VA benefits. Many of you have heard about Trump's rally in Madison Square Garden in New York City, where a comedian, one of many people opening for Trump, asked the audience if they knew that there was a giant floating island of garbage in the ocean. "It's called Puerto Rico," he said. There was so much backlash to that comment that it is the only comment that Trump has disavowed. Though it was also noted that it had been cleared before the rally and was loaded onto the teleprompter. That's the bad news. Where's the good news? That's a fair question. USA Today interviewed people in 18 communities called Hope across the United States and learned valuable lessons about the importance of close connections with your neighbors, about the intersection of national politics and local issues, and what it means to truly call a community home. Neighbors getting into a room with neighbors, realizing that you have more in common than your differences. Understanding that it's the small local elections that sometimes make the biggest differences in people's daily lives. And one of my favorites, Bruce Springsteen, noted that this is one of the most important elections in his lifetime. He said, "Perhaps not since the Civil War has the country felt as politically, spiritually, and emotionally divided. It doesn't have to be that way. The common values, the shared stories that make this a great and united nation are waiting to be rediscovered and retold once again." Now that will take time, he writes. He says, "Hard work, intelligence, faith, and women and men with the national good guiding their hearts. America is the most powerful nation on earth, not just because of our overwhelming military strength or our economic power, but because of what she stands for, what she means, what she believes in. Freedom, social justice, equal opportunity, the right to be in love with who you want. These are the things that make America great." The other thing I read yesterday was a piece about the White Rose, which was a resistance group in Germany during the Holocaust. Their members were killed, but they did some good, and we remember them 75 years later. My friends, no matter what happens next week, let's stay in connection with our neighbors, with our friends and our families and our entire communities. It is going to take all of us to make it. It is going to take all of us to move forward as a nation that values not only freedom and democracy, but justice and decency. Let's be those people. May it ever be so. Blessed be, and amen.